Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third block of the Florida Race Equity Challenge, Changing the System. Today's webinar is Changing Our Lens, Healing Relationships Through Restorative Practices. My name is Natalie Steiner, and I'll be your moderator for today. Please feel free to submit any questions that you might have for our presenters throughout our webinar, and we will answer as many as we can at the end of our presentation. With that being said, it is my pleasure to introduce our first presenter today. Nicoletta Nikki Zen is the Academic Director and an instructor in the Department of Mental Health, Law, and Policy at the University of South Florida. She received her specialist in education in curriculum and instruction with an emphasis in school psychology. Mrs. Zen served as the Executive Director of the Multi-Agency Network for Students with Emotional and Behavioral Disabilities and the Youth Mental Health Awareness and Training Administration projects. Mrs. Zen also served as a member of the Task Force on Involuntary Examination of Minors, the Governor's Roundtable on School Safety, the Children's Mental Health System of Care State Advisory Team, the statewide multi-agency review team, and the Florida Youth Justice Commission. Mrs. Zen has over 20 years of combined experience working in the education and public health arena. Thank you for being with us today, Nikki.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm excited to be here and speaking to something that is near and dear to my heart, which is how we make all of our students successful. And so today I'd like to begin by talking about the three things that youth need to become successful adults. So we need to make sure that our youth have these three things, these three common traits, or often described as protective factors or assets. And these three things are good cognitive skills and initiative, the ability and the initiative to learn. We often think about lifelong learners, so this is going to be something that's going to carry them in through their adulthood. The ability to self-regulate. And to self-regulate, what we're really talking about is the ability to control their emotions, their desires, and their actions, of course, at developmentally appropriate levels. This is also known as good executive functioning skills. A strong adult-child relationship. That's the relationship that any adult can be. It doesn't have to be a parent or a guardian. It's a relationship with a youth that allows that child to feel safe, allows them to be heard, and allows them to feel loved. That child knows that they're loved, they're heard, they're safe, and that they are important. So if we want our children to become productive and resilient members of our communities, then we need to strive to make sure that each of our children possesses these three protective factors. So you're looking at now is a dollar bill. It's a plain old dollar bill. And our currency in 1957 changed, followed from a joint resolution by the 84th Congress and approved by President Dwight Eisenhower July 30th of 1966. And it requires that U.S. currency have "In God We Trust" on all currency. And being that I'm a data geek, I wanted to share with you one of my favorite quotes, and one that I use quite often when I'm sharing data with others that might find that data a little difficult to hear. And the quote actually comes from Edwards Deming: "In God we trust, all others bring data." So as we begin to explore the data, with the hope that it can lead to action, interventions, and supports to increase positive outcomes for youth and students, we really need to look at our data, not through a lens of blame, but through an investigative lens. I want you to ask yourself, what does the data tell me about the youth's outcome as we're looking at it? Does the data make me feel uncomfortable? Why am I uncomfortable looking at this data? Next, I ask you to take ownership of your data. Yes, this is the data that says what the outcomes are. Then ask, are these outcomes what we want them to be? Are these the outcomes that we want our children in our community, in our state, in our country to have? Then based on the answers to your own questions, act with vigilance to change what you know is the cause of the data outcomes we don't want, the ones that make us uncomfortable. Keep changing what we are doing or how we are causing harm to our children and students until we see the data we want to see and the outcomes we were proud of. So when a student disrupts a class, a school can disrupt that student's education or their entire life. How does that happen? So what the research tells us is that dropping out of school and going to jail are actually associated with suspensions and expulsions, arrests, and referrals to law enforcement. These are consequences that schools oftentimes will use. We need to make every parent, teacher, and even stakeholder aware that exclusionary discipline practices create a data outcome, and that outcome is often referred to as the school-to-prison pipeline. The analysis found that the consequences happen more frequently to Black students, especially as young as preschool. These children are expelled and suspended. Consequences are also more harsh for students than they are for their white peers for the exact same behavior. And the data further suggests that these consequences are not for violent offenses, but more often than not, the offenses or the consequences are for nonviolent offenses. So you're looking at the Civil Rights Data Collection from 2015-16, which was released in 2018. That data is now currently being analyzed and scheduled to be released again. But during the 2015-16 school year, you'll see that Black students represented 15% of the total student enrollment. And you can see that from the light blue shaded area on the chart. However, they accounted for 31% of students who were referred to law enforcement or were arrested. There's actually a 16-point discrepancy or disparity among their fellow white peers. In figure 11, when reviewing the distribution of students subjected to restraints and seclusions, white students were 49% of all enrolled students and 48% of students who were restrained and 55% of students that were secluded. However, for our Black students, they accounted for 15% of the students enrolled, 27% of students restrained, and 23% of students secluded. Once again, the disparity is profound. So in figure 13, the chart shows the distribution of students receiving one or more out-of-school suspension by race and sex. Looking at the first bar in the chart, Black male students represented 8% of students of enrolled students and accounted for 25% of students who received out-of-school suspension. Black females represented 8% of the students enrolled and accounted for 14% of students who received an out-of-school suspension. Once again, the disparities are obvious. Figure 15 from the U.S. Department of Education shows once again the same profound disparities for Black students. Black male students represented 8% of the enrolled students and accounted for 23% of students expelled, whereas Black females represented 8% of the student enrollment and accounted for 10% of students who were expelled. So what does suspensions and expulsions do, and how is the connection to the school-to-prison pipeline there for students of color and for students with disability? Well, suspending and expelling students leaves students out of the one child serving agency or system that we want our youth to be in, and that would be the education system. Children belong in the education system. I think we can all agree with that. As we continue to examine the data, I ask you to continue to consider a question. Is our education system systematically failing certain groups of students, for example, students of color, students with disabilities, LGBTQ students? Are they disproportionately over and or incorrectly categorized in special education? Are they disciplined more harshly, including referral to law enforcement for minimal misbehavior? Achieve at lower levels without interventions? And eventually, are these same youth the ones that dropped out or were pushed out of school, often into juvenile justice facilities and prison? This data, a pattern, is referred to as the school to prison pipeline. We know that in the 2005-2016 school year, over 2.7 million K-12 public school students were suspended one or more times. They're missing academic instruction and they're being excluded from their classroom. Or looking at it differently, they're being excluded from actually becoming part of that classroom or that environment, as well as excluded from the very information we need them to be successful, how to read, how to write, and how to learn to get along with others. The data found that school level factors influencing the number of suspensions included the principal's perspective on discipline, which directly impacted the out-of-school suspension for students of color. So we know that a person's perspective can change the whole trajectory of a child's future. Students with disabilities are twice as likely to be suspended, and the data found once again that students of color do not commit more defensible, disciplinable offenses than their white peers. The data also found that students of color receive substantially more school discipline than their white peers. Students of color and students with disabilities receive harsher and longer punishments than their non-disabled peers for the very same offenses. So once again, I ask you to look at that picture, the school to prison pipeline. Is it a path from student to criminal? The U.S. Commission on Civil Rights in 2019 also found that in schools with the highest concentration of school resource officers, those very same schools had at least half the student population was not white. They had higher poverty rates. They had the highest arrest rates for offenses like disorderly conduct and fighting. Students of color at these schools were more likely to attend a school with an SRO, but not one with a student counselor. So there are several civil rights laws that schools and communities may be violating that were actually put in place to protect students of color and students with disability. These include the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which forbids discrimination against students of color, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and the 1990 Americans with Disability Act, or ADA, specifically bans disability discrimination in education. There are laws to protect our students. So now that we've looked at the federal level, I also wanted us to look at Florida's state data. So what does our discipline data look like? And I pulled I was actually able to access the 2017 and the 2018 academic years. So what we're looking at is for these 2017 and 2018 academic school years. In the columns, you'll find the discipline description, followed by race and the percent of the total. And in the last row, so for example, in the yellow row in 2017-18 and the purple in 2018-19, you'll find this Florida student membership population. And so what we found in these years, pretty close statistically, was that for our Black or African American students accounted roughly for 22% of our total population and for 37% of the total in school suspensions, 41% of the total of out-of-school suspensions, and 41% of placement in alternative educational settings. So even here, even in our own state, even past 2016, we have issues with disproportionate discipline for our African American and our Black students, our students of color. So what is this? Why is this important? If you're in academics, why is this important? Well, it's very important because what we found is that where do we begin? Should we begin looking at this data in middle school or high school? But actually, we can go back to kindergarten, we can go back to pre-K, and we can see that if we're absent, where students are absent, their academic performance is impaired. They become at risk of needing reading interventions. As you can see in this slide, you'll see that those who did not have chronic absences had some risk, However, by the end of second grade, those who were chronically absent in the preceding years were at highest risk for not being able to read. In our next slide, you say, well, how do we know that impacts our African American students? Well, if we look at our next slide, and that's looking at attendance and English language arts performance based on grade level standards, what we find is that with districts who had low attendance, the percentage of students on grade level for English language arts was also very low. And that for students who had high attendance, the students' percentage at grade level was a lot higher. So we can see it directly impacts, attendance directly impacts a student's ability to learn and to access academic curriculum. So on our next slide, what you're looking at are that second trait, which is self-regulation. And I wanted to talk about this at the end because there's really not the data other than having to go into the neurobiology of our system and how we respond, how we react, how our body reacts to stress. But when a child has or an adult has good emotional or self-regulation, what that really translates into is I can be patient, I can wait, I know I'm being heard, I know you understand, and I know I'm safe. And so even though we may not be happy with what's happened or the answers we've been given, it's okay because we know someone's listening to us, we're being heard, and we're understood. Now, I want you to think about the last time that you got really upset. I mean upset. You know, that time when your voice maybe got a little louder, when maybe you had to clench your fist or grit your teeth. Think about it. Were you being heard? Were you trying to get your point across and the audience wasn't hearing you? Were they not paying attention, or were they not giving you even the opportunity to speak? If you find yourself in that situation without good self-regulation skills, you're more likely to become dysregulated. With emotional dysregulation, when that occurs, a child or an adult feels threatened or they feel not heard, the behavioral results are emotional dysregulation. They simply cannot calm down, not in that state. You have to take control. So some of us breathe deeply, some of us use progressive muscle relaxations. We have different ways when we reach this phase. However, for a child, it's very difficult without those skills in their toolbox to calm themselves down. But also for adults, it's very hard once you've become dysregulated to calm down. You need to put time and space between you and how you're reacting. In many ways, our students are the same way, and they simply cannot calm down. And so we need to implement alternatives to suspension and expulsions. We need to look at these alternatives and make sure that they increase physical and emotional safety of the whole school community, both the students and the teachers. We need to teach students and adults how to de-escalate themselves, but also someone else who's dysregulated. We need to ensure each student has a mentor and a caring adult to provide a safe relationship and allow students to know they will be heard. Provide access to appropriate school and community mental health supports. Provide instruction in social and emotional learning, executive functioning, and instruction in restorative practices. Being heard and acknowledged is a beginning, or it's a path. It's a start to a different path. On our next slide, the Florida Department of Education has begun trying to shift that path for our students and our youth. And I've included the web link here, so I hope each of you will go to the site and look at your data, because you can find your school's data here, your local district data, but you will also find information about school climate. You'll also find information about discipline and alternatives to suspension and expulsions, and some of those tools that are actually available through the Department of Education. But you'll also find, if you want to implement something like restorative practices where everyone knows they will be heard and have the opportunity to speak, they're also there too. We've come to the end of my presentation, and I want to thank you for allowing me to take you on a journey looking just at a bird's eye view of the federal and state data. As you begin, and I hope you do, to review your own local data, remember to ask yourself, is it where you want to be? Don't admire the problem if you find one and try to assign blame. Instead, I challenge you to own your data and work with your stakeholders to make the type of challenges that will lead you to the type of results you want to see. So you will take ownership of your local data. How will you change your data? How can you change your data? Come together with your stakeholders and figure out ways to make the outcomes you want to see so that you're seeing the data you want to see. And in that data, ensure that our Florida communities are inclusive, welcoming, and provide the type of results we want all of our children in all of our schools, agencies, and communities. Thank you.
Very much for that wealth of information, Nikki. I know I got a lot out of that. So next, I'm excited to introduce our second presenter to everyone. Jeffrey Weisberg is the co-founder and executive director of the River Phoenix Center for Peacebuilding and lead trainer of restorative justice, police youth dialogues, and conflict coaching practices, both within the United States and internationally. His passion and skill in transforming problem orientations to solutions assists individuals and communities in building bridges of understanding and cooperation. He has developed a comprehensive community peace-building model that is supporting schools, law enforcement agencies, prisons, the U.S. State Department, and neighborhoods to break the cycle of violence and build resiliency. Thank you for being with us, Jeff.
Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. So happy to be here with you all. And thank you, Nikki, for that presentation. It's really evident to me how important it is that we have partnerships with different stakeholders, different practitioners, from academics and law enforcement, education, civil service, etc., really looking at how do we affect change? How do we bring to bear some of these best and next practices to serve our children and families and the community as a whole? So I'll be sharing with you for a little bit about some of the work that we're doing at our center and in partnership with different agencies throughout the state of Florida. So when we ask the question, what does it mean to be restorative? We're starting with the question of how do we engage and empower young people to have a stake in creating community and creating the outcomes that they wish for as well. I think if you were to ask young people, what they want for their future, do they want to end up in, out of school or in criminal justice system, or to have a life of joy and success? Everyone wants that. And so it's really incumbent upon us that we look at different ways of affecting this change and supporting young people's success. And for us, looking at through a restorative lens is one of those ways, because we want to be treated with dignity, fairness, and respect. And in our criminal justice system and in our discipline systems in schools, a lot of times the young people feel really marginalized, and they feel at the effect of, even victimized, that a lot of times it's unfair. And so when we think about what it means to be restorative, we are needing to take on a different lens as people in power, as adults, as administrators, as law enforcement, etc. And are we willing to share power in certain ways to bring young people more into this experience? And I was appreciating what Nikki was talking about in terms of what young people need, in terms of good cognitive skills, the ability to self-regulate, and a strong relationship with adults. And in the restorative field, if you will, all of those are really embedded into the practice of building relationship through accountability and everyone's voices being heard. One of my favorite quotes by a man named Dominic Barter, who's a specialist in restorative justice and restorative practices, he says, rather than being dangerous, conflict holds within it vital messages regarding unmet needs and areas of necessary change. Given this understanding, safety is increased, not by avoiding conflict, but by moving toward it with the intention of hearing the messages within. And this to me just is one of my pole stars, if you will, because I've been a certified mediator for about 25 years and literally facilitated several thousand people in conflict. And what I've seen is this very quote of what comes from our ability and our capacity to go towards conflict, to understand what might be driving the behavior. And a lot of times if we were to see an iceberg, we only see 15% of a human being. And we often see that in behavior, and that's all that we're addressing. Get out of the classroom, go to juvenile detention, go to jail or prison, without really understanding what all those factors are. And if we want to prevent different repeat behaviors, then it's very, very important that we take this quote and explore different ways of moving into conflict constructively. And that's what restorative practices can do for us. So a paradigm shift. You can see on the left, at least on my screen, where you have the adult looking over the children or the administrator behind his desk. And this is the old paradigm of how we deal with conflict and discipline in many ways. And so for many of us, it does require a shift in our ability to share the space with our students and with our young people, as well as their families and the community, in a circle context where everyone's voice matters, and that we have the opportunity to explore what happened, how that impacted me, on you, our community, our school. What can I do to repair that harm, and how do we prevent it from happening in the future? So it's really a different mindset, if you will, of how we explore these different behaviors and conflicts and dynamics, because we believe that conflict is inevitable, but violence is not. Violence is a learned behavior. So there are some distinctions when we look at a restorative justice model versus a punitive model. So in a school context, a school rule is broken. We understand that there's certain student code of conduct, etc. But in a restorative approach, people and relationships are harmed or impacted. In the punitive approach, justice is focused on who did it, versus what were the needs and responsibilities of all of those people involved. And accountability in the punitive approach equals punishment, right? Mandatory minimums, you have these sentencing guidelines, etc. Whereas in a restorative approach, accountability is understanding the impact and one's willingness and ability to be accountable, to address those harms and that impact in more creative and constructive ways. And in the punitive approach, justice focuses on the offender, and oftentimes the victim or the person who has received that harm is ignored or sidelined. Whereas in a restorative approach, the victim, the offender, the person who caused the harm, the person who received the harm, and the school community all come together because they're all stakeholders. And then finally, in a punitive, rules and intent outweigh whether the outcomes are positive or negative. So it doesn't often matter what your intent was. Whereas in a restorative approach, the offender is responsible for the behavior and repairing that harm, and looking at really how to prevent that from happening in the future. And so we often refer to the restorative approach as a social and emotional learning process, really looking at self-reflection, self-regulation, understanding impact on others. So these are some social skills, and that emotional intelligence is really embedded within restorative practices. So restorative practices really is on a continuum. And there's restorative practices versus restorative justice. And what we mean when we talk about restorative practices is the overarching umbrella, the whole continuum of different strategies that we can use. Restorative justice is often understood as the most formal process of dealing with conflict, harm, or crimes. And in the schools, what we say is that restorative practices really needs to be about 80% of our efforts in dealing with relationships, growing a language of understanding, different restorative spaces, conversations, and these can happen every day or every week, so that if there were an incident to occur and we needed to do a more formal process, that already some of those practices and languages and distinctions are understood. So we have a short video that we want to show you just for a couple of minutes that's kind of hot off the press, that gives a real wonderful overview of restorative practices.
Our world is changing at a breathtaking pace. Social patterns that have long characterized human life are changing dramatically around the globe, diminishing social bonds within families, schools, workplaces, and communities. But humans are hardwired to connect. Just as we need food, shelter, and clothing, we also need strong and meaningful relationships to thrive. With all this in mind, what is restorative practices? Restorative practices is an emerging social science that studies how to strengthen relationships between individuals and within communities. When put into practice, the effects are profound. In schools, students experience greater safety and sense of belonging, resulting in improved behavior, less bullying, and less violence. In workplaces, leaders facilitate direct communication among staff and address conflict as it arises. The result is higher performance, greater accountability, and effective collaboration. In criminal justice, new options allow victims and offenders, friends and family, to repair the emotional harm caused by crime. Throughout our neighborhoods, restorative practices give regular people more voice in the issues that matter most. In a nutshell, restorative practices is the science of relationships and community. Your individual daily interactions have a big impact on the world around you, at your job, with young people, and throughout your community. How we relate matters. This video was brought to you by the International Institute for Restorative Practices. To learn more, attend our flagship event, Basic Restorative Practices, enroll in a graduate course, or join us at a world conference.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. So at our center, the River Phoenix Center for Peace Building in Gainesville, Florida, we've been using restorative justice and restorative practices in many different settings, really around prevention, diversion, probation. And so in our partnership with schools and with law enforcement and with other youth agencies, restorative justice can be used as a prevention tool, really, to gain some insight around behavior, what drives behavior, how does that impact other people. So it's a really important part of your toolkit to think about how we change behavior. And then in diversion, it's used throughout Florida. Many people are on this webinar are using diversion programs or have partnerships with diversion programs. We have a contract working with Broward County and their Children's Services Council, and they use restorative justice as part of their diversion program for young people who have an incident that that would benefit really from being held accountable, but more in a constructive way, that they have a voice in terms of understanding the impact of their incident that they were involved in. Probation, we've trained many probation officers in Alachua County, and while young people have certain sanctions that they need to fulfill, restorative justice processes can be one important element of holding young people accountable. But also, while they're on probation, things happen. They have upsets with their family and peers, etc. And so having a restorative circle can be very, very helpful for probation officers to facilitate themselves or with other outside people, and using that practice, if you will, to support youth and families. And then one of our flagship partnerships really is Project Connect, which is one of the state's largest reentry programs. Twin Oak is the parent organization for that. But Project Connect works with from Daytona all the way north on reentry. And so we partnered with them and developed what's called a family reintegration circle. So prior to the young person returning from the program, they're interviewed and supported as to what their experience was in the program, what led them to go in there in the first place, and their vision and concerns as to coming home. And so they have about a 95% success rate in terms of young people participating in a FRC or Family Reintegration Circle, and 100% success in terms of discharge from those restorative circles, because the young person is really a part of making that plan going forward. And so this is all just to tell you some different ways that restorative practices can be utilized. But for us, one of the key areas that we find using a restorative process is what we call an educator-student dialogue. And so we have been working with law enforcement agencies in Alachua County and throughout the state and different parts of the country to bring young people, particularly African American youth, together with police to have a conversation for 3 or 4 hours to really unpack different stereotypes and bias. And so we've taken that same model and brought it into schools between teachers and students. And so a circle is really an area where we can share power, everyone's voices is heard, and that we can start to practice those emotional intelligence competencies of self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and conflict resolution. And we've been conducting these dialogues for the last number of years in middle and high school. We bring together anywhere from 6 to 10 students and the same number of teachers, if at all possible. We really like to mix up the groups of students so they're representing different demographics and different groups. Not all the A students, not all the more challenged students perhaps, but really a mixture can be very effective. And we're really looking at creating an opportunity for young people to have their voices heard around what are some of the issues and concerns that they have. Here you have a picture of 2 of the boys who were in small breakout groups brainstorming what it is that they wanted to change at the school. And what they found for themselves was the top priority was how do they enhance relationship skills between teachers and students. And so they came up with an action plan to move forward with that. This next photo is of Kanapaha Middle School, just being silly with some of the students. And what we found as a result of these dialogues is that some of these kids do have a higher number of referrals, but by giving them a voice to participate and to share some of their concerns and their issues that they're dealing with in class and out of class, that they've dropped down their referral rate significantly. And one of the activities that we do is an A to Z in separate groups. So we have the students separate from the teachers, and we have the alphabet that you can see right there. And the students, this is probably the adults list of the students. And so they're asked to give adjectives that describe the students or the teachers that start with an A and a B and a C. And so this is a really, really effective way of gathering data and information and perceptions of each group of the other, that then when we come back together in a full group, we unpack and debrief. And here's another, this is the middle school of the young people presenting their plan to the rest of the group of what they want to do moving forward to help improve relationships. So this is an overview of the agenda of a dialogue. And we're happy to be a resource and guide you in some of these different dialogues if that's something you're interested in. We offer training as well. But essentially, we're really starting in split groups to do the A to Z and find out what their issues and concerns are. Coming back together, we start building the container through introductions and an icebreaker, where we're co-collaborating agreements. How do we want to treat each other? Then we are exploring in more detail what are some of the issues and concerns both adults and students are experiencing, so that they could kind of take on a different perspective. We do a role play where the students become the teachers and the teachers are the students. This is actually a highlight. The instruction for the teachers is that you could do anything in this role play that you've ever experienced in a classroom. And so if you could imagine, it's mayhem, it's crazy. And the students are always frustrated because they're trying to deliver a lesson and it's impossible. And so this is kind of a shifting point in the dialogue where young people oftentimes apologize. They say, oh my goodness, I can't believe this is what you deal with every day. I couldn't do it. And so that perspective taking really helps. And then we look at a brainstorm of how to, solve some of these issues and concerns. And here, this is Dr. Carrie Geiger, who is the principal of PK Young. This is one of the schools that we're working with where the whole staff have been and faculty have been trained in restorative practices. She just gives a little overview.
When we first started implementing restorative practices at PK Young, it was in response to our referral data. We are striving for equity in everything that we do on campus. And when we looked at our referral data, we noticed inequities there and discrepancies that were very troubling to us. And so restorative practices was a way to address those. And our referral data and our disciplinary data has definitely changed. But something else that we noticed is that implementing restorative practices really just gave us an opportunity to get to know each other as human beings. Teachers and students coming to a table to discuss issues in ways that they hadn't ever discussed them before. And we saw amazing transformations in relationships between teachers and students. An example that comes to mind really quickly is a student who was consistently tardy to a teacher's classroom, and she was just over it. It was the first period of the day, and she just had him pegged as lazy and irresponsible. And when we sat down at the table, he began to tell us that every morning he got up at 5 a.m. and he dropped off 3 siblings at 3 different schools and his mother at our local hospital before getting to campus. And as he's telling the story of what his daily morning looked like, you could see that teacher's eyes was filling with tears because she had no idea. And she said to him, I had no idea that this is what your life was like every morning. And now, rather than seeing him as irresponsible, she sees the huge burden that's on this 17-year-old kid that he is having to deal with every single day. And she said to him, had I known that this is what you're dealing with, I would have addressed the situation so differently. And I guess the question is, Why didn't you know? You know, we don't take time to get to know each other as human beings. And when we do, when we take the moment to sit and talk about reasons for behavior and try to figure out what the motivations or causes behind that behavior are, we see each other differently. We treat each other differently, and I think we care about each other differently. And so that's what we're striving to do at PK Young. We're striving to get to know our kids in different ways and really look at each other as human beings, hear each other as human beings, and work out problems when they arise together collaboratively. So we're really excited about what's ahead for us at our school.
Yes, so that's a really exciting partnership with PK Young and some of the other schools, but they are kind of diving full on in terms of training all their staff and faculty, using advisory, which is teachers and students' weekly or daily meetings and check-ins and circles to help grow that competence, as I was saying earlier, that 80%. And then also through the racial equity lens of really looking at and engaging in conversations that we might not normally have around race and equity. But so what is our goal? For many of us, it's really about how do we grow cooperation? Obviously, it's about changing behavior, but in order to change behavior, we have to have cooperation. So what are the ways that we bring respect and trust to the table? And this idea of building connection before we correct. So connect before you correct. So obviously some of this does take more time, but when you think about some of the discipline behaviors and the frequency of that, how much time that really does take in a school setting, or even in a criminal justice setting, that restorative justice, restorative practices is one of those ways of building cooperation. And this next slide is really powerful, and I hope you can research this a little bit more, but this is called the SCARF model, developed by David Rock. And so this is an essential element of why do restorative practices work. So SCARF stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. So status has to do with I matter. I have a place in this circle. Certainty, we always tell the young people what the process is going to look like. No surprises. So I know what's coming around the corner. And again, if you have any understanding of adolescent brain development, certainty is one of those things that's important to keep the prefrontal cortex engaged. Autonomy. I have choice and power in this situation. I'm here because I choose to be. I'm here because I am invited. I'm here because I'm valued. But I also have choice in what goes into the agreement or not. Relatedness, again, tying back into what Nikki was talking about in terms of having an engaged adult, that you will have a support person in the circle with you. And so feeling a sense of connectedness and relatedness. And then fairness. I'm willing to be held accountable because I believe and trust that the process is fair. And so this is used more in a human resource context in business, but it really applies profoundly into restorative justice practices. And this is something that you can research a little bit more and hopefully incorporate into your practices. So that concludes my presentation, but I believe we're going to do some questions and answers right now. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Jeff, for all of that wonderful information. And I would like to invite Nikki back on camera as well. And we're going to facilitate a few questions with each of you. So, Nikki, the first question is for you. And the question is, how do you suggest that we deal with those system partners that don't take responsibility for the data, or that might feel like their role in the system does not have an impact on the data?
Right, so I think when we look at the data and we realize that this data begins when children are 2, 3, 4, and 5, We all as a community can play a role. Just because one part of our system may be broken or not functioning, or maybe they're not ready to look at their data, doesn't mean that the rest of us can't make a change. It just takes one adult in a child's life to make a change. It doesn't take the whole community. So bearing that in mind, it could be just one person or one system that makes the change, and others will follow.
Thank you, Nikki. Next question is for you, Jeff. Is there a stronger sense of receptiveness when the facilitator looks like the offender or the family when employing restorative practices?
That's an awesome question. I believe that it is something for us to strive for more diligently than we already are, whether it's in education, law enforcement, really anywhere. If there are only white officers policing a predominantly African American community, or only white teachers in classrooms that are predominantly youth of color, similarly in facilitation, that a lot of times youth and adults will feel a certain affinity with people that look like them. And so it's not required, especially if facilitators are truly engaged and committed to the process. But how do we extend more opportunities for people who might be representative of that community or that group to step into leadership roles and to have those positions of influence and power? And that's something that I think white facilitators, people in positions of power who are white, can have some sway in, is inviting more people in to participate.
Thank you, Jeff. And Nikki, your next question is, do children with more involved parents receive less harsh punishments than their peers?
Well, that's a good question. With more involved parents, and the level of involvement is subjective to the response or the relationship with the child. So I don't have access to that data to let you know for sure where that data falls. So I encourage whoever asked that question to either get in touch with me and I will help them with finding the data for that question. So level of parent involvement. However, when we look at our data today, the data that was presented really was not looking at the level of parental involvement.
Thank you, Nikki. And as Nikki has emphasized throughout this presentation, the data is the queen, right? So, Jeff, our next question is, can you share an example of a time that restorative practices had a positive impact on a situation that most people did not think it would?
Sure. This young man he's 18 years old, so he was just finishing up high school, and he was involved in an armed home invasion. And so he had a gun with some of his buddies to go in to rob somebody's house, and terrified the victim, the man who was living there, and he ended up running away. Unfortunately, he was not harmed physically. So the young person was arrested and was spending time in jail pre-sentencing. And it was brought up the possibility of doing a restorative circle with the victim and this young man, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, this boy was facing 10 years to life. And so the victim agreed to participate in this, and had such a profound kind of shift in his own experience, and felt really understood, and the boy's parents were there, and he was heading off to college, and really felt like he did not want this young person to go to prison. And so the prosecutor agreed, and so they went before the judge, and the judge heard them out and accepted the agreement that was concluded in the restorative process, that this young person would not face prison time. He did face 6 years of probation, but it was a kind of an extreme example of how profound a restorative process can be in terms of holding people accountable while really understanding all the other driving factors that exist. And then, of course, that example that Carrie Geiger gave, and many others, of bringing people together to have a conversation, and through that conversation, actually, as simple as it may seem, that it really reveals different elements while holding people accountable.
Excellent. Thank you, Jeff. And this will be our last question for each of you. So first, Nikki, how might we better support youth that seem to exhibit troubled behaviors more often than others to reduce these behaviors without the long-term impact of the juvenile justice system?
Right. So behaviors begin long before students get to school. However, they tend to escalate, but just as you would teach a child who can't read, we don't just give up. We don't raise our hands and say, well, okay, well, we tried. You're just not going to learn how to read. Or too bad, math is too hard. You don't need that. You really don't need that addition. That's okay. We really need to look at behavior in the same process as we look at all academics, all health, and determine what type of interventions, and not give up on our youth until they're able to regulate, until they're able to access. And it all goes back to how much time, how much motivation, and obviously financially, how much money we're willing to spend to get and support a child. So I think a shift has to happen in that we really need to treat behavior as something that's teachable. And it's not something that just happens. We are not born knowing how to self-regulate. We have to be methodical about how we teach it, just like reading or math.
That is a wonderful example, Nikki. And finally, Jeff, how can we initiate conversations with law enforcement and other stakeholders to begin using and engaging in restorative practices?
It does take an opening, for sure, within these institutions, a willingness to really try some different things out, for sure. But when I think about, there's a great book called The Speed of Trust that I highly recommend by Stephen M.R. Covey, so the son of Stephen Covey, who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Successful People. And what he talks about is there's character and competence as the building blocks of trust. And the competence piece is that we do have to have a meaningful product, if you will. We need to have some evidence-based or next practices that we bring to these different situations. I believe most law enforcement and many educational institutions recognize that what they're doing is not enough. In many cases, just does not work. And so if you're able to bring some data and looking at different models that may exist in other parts of the world or the country, and then having, try it out. Just if you can get in the door to have one positive experience, and then that starts to grow. And how we developed it in Alachua County is that we did a training on police-youth dialogues, and then we tried one. And it was a smashing success. It was amazing. And so the chief got 100% on board, and they just started to do them every month. And then it started to grow. And from there, we got what's called a DMC coordinator, disproportionate minority contact coordinator in each agency. And those started to grow some of their own practices. And so it has to do with character and competence, really, of engaging in relationships. And if I may, Natalie, I just want to add one more piece to what the question was for Nikki. Everyone should read the ACE study. and understand what trauma is and adverse childhood experiences. And that what we see, the data shows that 50% of our youth in DJJ have 2 or more ACEs, 2 or more adverse childhood experiences. There's a direct correlation between traumatic ACEs as children and health outcomes and behavioral outcomes. And so we have to be better trained, trauma-informed, trauma-responsive trained in all of our efforts. And I think if we were trauma-informed courtrooms, classrooms, and law enforcement, there's some really important strategies of interrupting the cycle of violence and building resiliency.
Well, thank you both sincerely for your expert opinions and feedback today. I know I've learned a lot today, and I know that all of our audience members have as well. So I'd really like to remind all of our audience members that the PowerPoints that you saw today and the PowerPoints that you see for all of the webinars are uploaded onto the Florida Race Equity Challenge website, along with the recorded version of the presentations. So I want to sincerely thank our audience members for tuning in today, and please join us again on September 16th for our next webinar, Equality Florida. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.